sustainable entrepreneurship. My name is Hannah Hoffman, and I'll be moderating this panel discussion today. I know we have a bunch to get through and probably not nearly enough time, so I do want to get started right away, but first I also do want to acknowledge the other students who helped put this panel together. I drew the long straw, so to speak, and I get to speak with our panelists today, but we all put in a lot of work, so thanks to Lauren Ginsberg and Casey Hayes-Dietz and Blake Liu for making this all happen. By the way, Lauren is our backup moderator, so if my Wi-Fi gives out or anything, she'll just jump in and kind of take over. But with that being said, I guess we have four panelists today, and I'd like to allow each of them to briefly introduce themselves. And after that, we'll get into some questions. And just as a heads up to the audience, we have a few minutes at the end. Sorry about my cat. We have a few minutes at the end for Q&A, so feel free to submit questions at any time, just through the chat feature, and we'll make sure we get to those at the end. But with no further ado, Miranda, would you like to start us off with just a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure, and thank you so much, Hannah, and also to Lauren and Casey and Blake for inviting all of us to participate in this panel. It's one of my favorite topics, and as a graduate of GW's business school, I love coming and speaking to GW, and I'm just disappointed that we can't be together because at the after chat with coffee and drinks and the like is always the most fun. So I'm Miranda Ballantyne. I'm currently the CEO of the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance. It is an 18-month-old trade association, so we are a startup representing large buyers of clean energy. Prior to this, I served President Obama as the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Installations, Environment, and Energy. So you can imagine the Pentagon is far from an entrepreneurial organization. It's a very large institution. And prior to that, I worked at Walmart, where I headed up Walmart's global renewable energy strategy team. So also very large institution. So I look forward to talking with the rest of the panel in just a couple minutes.
Thanks. We're really excited to have you with all of your range of experiences on the panel. Now, Stephen, I know you work in a very similar area as Miranda right now. So I was wondering if you'd like to introduce yourself and a little bit about what you do.
Stephen, sorry, I'm having a hard time with the interconnect. But anyways, hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Orbuck. I'm a director of business development and acquisitions at EDF Renewable Energy. EDF Renewable Energy is the U.S. affiliate of the large French utility, Energy de France. It's one of the largest renewable energy developers in North America and as well as the world. And my role at EDF is I do project acquisition, business development, contracting of renewable energy facilities, so primarily wind and solar. Thank you.
Thanks. Also glad to have you here. Now, Annie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. So my name is Annie Osborne. I'm one of 2 university innovation specialists at the Good Food Institute, and we are a nonprofit think tank that works to advance alternative proteins, including plant-based and cultivated meat and fermentation-derived ingredients that make alternative proteins better.
Thanks. We are very happy to have you here. And finally, Elijah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Elijah Inaswimsat, and I'm a managing consultant at Guidehouse. If you're not familiar with Guidehouse, we're a global strategy and, well, the part of the business I work on, we work in a lot of sectors, but I work in specifically on sustainability. We're a global strategy consulting firm. And my work centers on basically helping corporates and some municipalities figure out what their carbon impact is, set targets, science-based targets, we can talk about a little bit today, to reduce that impact, and then ultimately design strategies and implement strategies to achieve the reductions.
Thanks, Elijah, and thanks everyone. So I'm gonna stop sharing that screen so you can, I think you'll see everybody's faces a little bigger. And I guess now, before we get into open discussions, we still have some my team scripted some specific questions for each of the panelists. We talked a little bit with each of you before today, and you brought up some interesting things that we wanted to revisit, make sure before we get into this open discussion we're going to have. If you could, please try to keep your answers to about 2 or 2.5 minutes. And as a reminder to the audience, feel free to submit questions through the chat at any time. But starting again with Miranda, you introduced us to entrepreneurship in addition to the term entrepreneurship, and you've worked in an entrepreneurship role at Walmart before you transitioned to an entrepreneurship role when you started your own company. Could you explain that distinction and talk a little bit about how you think about entrepreneurship versus entrepreneurship?
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Like I said, it's a topic that I love to talk about because I believe that the world truly needs social and environmental entrepreneurs and social and environmental entrepreneurs. And many business schools in particular do focus on social and environmental entrepreneurship, like this week's conference and like today's discussion. And you can take classes and join clubs on how to be an entrepreneur. But there's very little discussion about the role of social and environmental entrepreneurs, which is really defined as individuals working to drive change within large institutions. And if you haven't read it, there's a fantastic pamphlet. Don't be scared off that it's 12 years old. It was written in 2008. It's called The Field Guide to Social Entrepreneurship. And I still think it's probably the best publication on the subject, though Net Impact and several other organizations have done quite a lot of writing on social and environmental entrepreneurship over the last decade or so. And entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs share many of the same traits. Both are very passionate about driving change in the world and using their professions to drive change in the world, whether that's for social issues or environmental issues. Both tend to be impatient. Both tend to want to change systems and create new ideas and bring them to life. Entrepreneurs tend to see the pathway to achieve the biggest change as working within large institutions. It's like moving a massive ship. Entrepreneurs tend to see the way to affect change is by working from outside of established systems. So there are a couple of kind of fundamental personal and professional characteristics and traits that differ in my experience. And I've seen entrepreneurs try to go into big companies and leave in frustration because they just can't stand the bureaucracy they have to work through. And I've seen people who are natural entrepreneurs try to start businesses and just be frustrated at the lack of structure and the lack of ability to really get those zeros behind their impact, the 9 zeros. So it's one of the things that when I'm talking to folks in business school that I really suggest you start to examine about yourself. So if you really like affecting change within a big system, you like structure, you like looking around and seeing what are the key levers that I can pull to drive change within a big institution and really get that big bang for the buck, then entrepreneurism is probably more for you. If the idea of working within a system, and if you consider bureaucracy to be a 4-letter word instead of a word that really inspires the idea of effectiveness and process to get things done, then maybe entrepreneurship is the better way to go. But I would definitely suggest everybody download that guide, the Field Guide to Social Entrepreneurship, and take a look.
Thanks, Miranda. Yeah, that was a term I'd never heard before, but ever since you kind of introduced it to us, I've definitely been thinking about it, and it's I'm sure we'll even be revisiting that during this discussion. And I guess moving on to Elijah. Elijah, you mentioned that you help corporations figure out how to reduce their carbon footprints. And every company is, of course, different, but can you speak in general terms about what sort of financial incentives the companies you work with might have for focusing on sustainability?
Absolutely. So yeah, as you mentioned, every company is different, but there definitely are some broader trends we can talk to. The big 2 buckets I'd say are avoiding risk and capturing opportunities, right? So on the risk side, you have huge drives from investors. Many may be aware of BlackRock's big call out to basically divestment from companies that aren't taking appropriate action on sustainability in so many words. And then also over the course of COVID, we've seen a number of companies that are categorized as more ESG or environmental, social, and governance, which is another term to talk about sustainability in broader sense. They outperformed those who are companies that were well mature on their ESG strategy, outperformed the market by as much as 20% over the course of COVID. So it's clear that purely from the investment perspective, there is definitely a risk to not taking action on this, and a benefit for investors to taking action on it. And the core of that is really on cases where there's unrecognized risks, right, that are not being capitalized, whether that's transitional risk. For example, if you have a bunch of fuel and the fuel is no longer to be used anymore because transition to renewable technologies, or physical risk if you have a facility that could be flooded by a larger than normal weather event as a result of climate change. And then also resiliency on the latter portion there. Resiliency is a huge risk, and there's a lot of connections here where companies, I work a lot in the food and beverage space, and you see, as food supply chains push more from conventional extractive practices to regenerative practices, there's more resilient, the supply chains become more resilient to those extreme weather events. Then on the opportunity side, we'll talk a lot about the pushes from customers. That's an obvious one that we're all aware of. But another one that I thought was interesting, that surprised to me when I was getting into this area, was push from employees. I've heard a number of interesting stories of companies that found, like in the tech sector, for example, heard a great keynote from a tech leader talking about how hard it was to find employees. There was twice the number of people they needed. Half the number of people they needed were coming out of universities with the degrees in tech that needed to hire. So it's a very competitive market. And they found that by taking action on these things, from their brand, sustainability, they could get way better candidates and better retention. And then there's also obviously the opportunity, on the opportunity side, the ability to open up whole new markets. So I'm sure Annie will talk about that with meat alternatives. And then finally, some of these things on sustainability, like energy efficiency projects, directly return to the bottom line. You're paying for less energy. So that's a clear financial incentive.
Thanks, Elijah. Yeah, so you just introduced a whole bunch of really good ideas there that I hope we'll have some more time to dig back into those individually. And we will. We have some questions specifically about a few of those things. But first, I want to ask Stephen, because Stephen, we talked a little bit before today's panel, and you mentioned push and pull factors. This may be a little bit related to what Elijah has been talking about. Consumer demand, for example, is a pull factor, pulling companies towards sustainability. But let's also talk a little bit about push factors. How has the evolving policy landscape created both opportunities and obstacles for your industry?
All right. Yeah. So thank you for the question. So with opportunities, there's a lot of policy items that impact and help the industry. And I'll just go through a couple of them. Many states and electric utilities have what's called renewable portfolio standards and emission goal targets. It's usually an X% by X year type format. So that creates a lot of opportunities. So for example, California is targeting 60% renewables by 2030. Imagine, given that those policies have teeth, imagine all the activity that creates as market participants and customers try to achieve those targets. My home state of New York, it has a 70% target by 2030. Utility in Virginia, right near George Washington University, Dominion, is actually targeting net zero emissions by 2050. So I'd love to see it sooner, but it still creates great opportunities even in the near term. There's a lot of tax-related credits and items that affect our business and benefit our business. So there's something called on the solar side, the solar investment tax credit. Basically, every solar system that comes in gets a 30% tax credit from the federal government. So that's a big driver of interest, and it also improves the economics of the types of transactions and systems I work on. So those are the two policy items I think that are important to highlight as drivers for customer adoption of renewables, and also just competitive pricing for renewables. obstacles, a couple to go over. One obstacle that we think about every day is the tax credit format is really, it's a blessing and a curse. It creates, tax credits typically will have, in the renewable side, will have an end date. So this type of credit sunsets by the end of the year 2023. So because renewable energy projects take a long time, the first thing the industry gravitates for when there's formats like that is, man, what's going to happen in 2024? So the tax credit format helps us. It also creates, let's call it artificial recessions and lumpiness in business. Tariffs, another obstacle. So unfortunately, renewable energy has really gotten pulled into the trade war with China, just the tariff discussion in general. That creates additional lumpiness in our business, and it also impacts the relative competitiveness of wind versus solar versus natural gas versus whatever else is on the electrical grid. A last item just to highlight in terms of complications with regard to policy. There really is no federal policy with regard to renewable energy. That makes it very difficult for there to be transmission investment. So just think of just big wires going from wind heavy regions to Washington, D.C., for example, or similar for solar projects. That lack of federal policy and support for infrastructure, it delays what can come online and the renewable energy that can come online to serve customers in various locations. So I said lots of opportunities and lots of setbacks and challenges with regard to the current policy landscape.
Thanks. That was also really interesting. I guess another very different dimension of the policy arena these days would maybe be the pandemic. And I'm guessing we'll touch on some of the impacts of the pandemic a little bit later and how that's affecting sustainability. But lastly, Annie, your background is a little bit different than all these other panelists. You play a very unique role in helping new products make it onto the market. Could you talk a little bit about your work connecting research to industry and the importance of partnerships?
Absolutely. So my role at the Good Food Institute is to support researchers who are doing either enabling science that helps industry improve the quality of alternative protein products, or who are doing direct research on alternative protein applications. So in academia, there's a fair amount of science that's been done on plant biology, on plant functionality, various plant ingredient applications that aren't necessary, that science is not necessarily being applied to the plant-based meat sector yet, or to that industry yet. But if that knowledge and that science is made publicly available, it sort of raises the baseline that all plant-based meat companies are starting from. So what we try to do is encourage partnerships between the private alternative protein industry and the public or academic research sector, so that there's some sort of baseline of shared knowledge and companies aren't trying to reinvent the wheel every time they work on a new product. This isn't just in plant-based meat, it's also in cultivated meat, and it's probably more important there. There's a fair amount of biomedical research, tissue engineering research that is really important and high cost that academia gets the funding to do and that industry doesn't necessarily get the venture capital or investment to do right away. And when industry does do that research, it's often protected by IP. So partnering between academia, getting a lot of open access information out there makes it a lot easier for new players to come into the marketplace and introduce new products without having to do the initial research legwork.
Got you. Thank you. And thank you again to all of you. Again, we're so glad that you all were willing to participate in this panel. From this point on, I just have a few kind of open questions and anybody should feel free to jump in. As a quick time check, we have about 20 minutes left. Time is definitely flying by. So I'll end this about 5 minutes before the end and we'll make sure we have time for questions from the audience. But first question, I know we touched on a little bit already, but I want to make sure everybody has a chance to comment on this. There is a lot of talk about increased consumer interest in sustainability. Is that really the main driver responsible for bringing sustainable options to the market? Or what else do you think is a key part of building a sustainable economy?
So I can jump in, and I know Annie and I talked about this a little bit in our pre-call. So certainly, if you're defining the term consumer as individuals like you and me, and we go to the grocery store and what types of things we buy, there is a desire and an increasing desire by individual citizens across the country and across the world for products and services that sustain the planet and people that live on the planet. At the same time, we know that there is a pretty significant population of people in this country that, although they want more sustainable products, they can't pay a premium for them. And then there's some folks that don't really care or aren't necessarily educated. So from my perspective, the more we can make every product sustainable, and when I was at Walmart, this was really our approach, was change the nature of every single product on our shelves so that every product that people buy is more sustainable. We used to call it democratizing sustainability. And if you can change what's available for everyone, that can change the market and change the state of products much faster than trying to change the opinions of the billions of people on the planet or the 330 million Americans that are making buying choices.
Yeah, so as you said, we talked about this a bit in our pre-call, but similar to the idea of democratizing sustainability, we like the idea of making the default choice the ethical and sustainable choice, so that a default choice would be competitive for food. It's competitive along the axes of taste, price, and convenience. For a non-food good, taste you can substitute out for the other major, whatever need you're trying to fulfill there. But for food, any alternative protein product has to taste as good as or better than conventional meat, eggs, or dairy, because people aren't going to be willing to sacrifice taste, cultural value, anything along those lines. It's going to have to be as cheap or less expensive, because very few people are willing to pay a premium for a sustainable product, and those who are willing can't necessarily pay that premium. Very few, relatively speaking. As Miranda was saying, there is a growing population of people willing to pay that premium. And then the last thing is convenience, which is a more nebulous term, but the idea is that you can't expect a large number of people to change their behavior around a good just because it is more sustainable. So from our perspective, talking about meat products, any alternative meat product, it needs to cook the same way. You need to be able to slot it into any recipe that you know, and it needs to fit into menus if you're ordering out in restaurants in such a way that you don't have to change your understanding of a dish that's coming to you. And that you can apply to other products as well. You just don't want to have the consumer need to change their behavior to incorporate a sustainable product into their life.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
oh, sorry, Elijah, go ahead.
No, all both really good points. And I guess the only piece I'd add to that, and totally agree, is that often part of the challenge too is what might be, there's often a gap between what seems sustainable, what's visibly sustainable. Like the classic case that I always think of is like, oh, I just bought my backpack. Oh, that backpack's way more sustainable. Let me throw mine away and go buy the sustainable backpack rather than using the one I had for the next 20 years, Or another one that's interesting when you work with in packaging right now, we're talking to a client who's looking at, transitioning from styrofoam to a paper product. And from the lens of purely carbon, actually paper products have a higher carbon footprint than styrofoam. But I think for other reasons, there's always the lens is always, there's always multiple lenses you can look at it with. So all that said, just following sometimes trend dependent or fickle consumer interest is not necessarily always going to result in the most sustainable final option. And then finally, there's also just a lot of parts of sustainability that the consumer has no, either can't even see, right? Like when walking into a Walmart, for example, maybe they make choices about what they take off the shelf, but they're not going to have any idea whether there's LEDs in the ceiling, and they're not going to know where the energy is sourced from. And those are huge impacts from Walmart, right? And there's those examples go across every single industry. So you need to start from the other side and understand what are the impacts to your company first, and then drive priorities there, rather than saying, hey, you know what, consumers, we really want this one product that is 1/100th of our company's footprint. Let's focus on putting all our energies into making that product seem more sustainable, right? It's just, and that's the way things are shifting as companies are starting to look more holistically at their impact.
Thanks, Elijah. Yeah, that's a good point. Like, these are complicated problems that everyone is tackling, and you have to look at the big picture. So moving a little bit along, what are some trends that you all have been watching in the area of sustainability or are interested to see evolve?
So one area that I'm particularly excited about or interested in, again, I'm more caught in the food and beverage space, has been starting to see places. I'm particularly excited about regenerative agriculture as a whole, and there's a lot to unpack there, and there's a lot of complexities there. But the biggest overarching theme that I think is exciting about that topic, and a lot of other sustainability topics follow this as well, is the fact that in the past, I was just mentioning the trade-off of okay, styrofoam's gonna be in the environment for 20,000 years, but the paper is gonna take more carbon to burn right now. We're always making these trade-offs. But the thing that's exciting, I think, about regenerative agriculture and other trends, and I think this is the direction of sustainability as a whole, is starting to align these different trade-offs. What's good for the farmer who's struggling financially, it also happens to be good for the consumer who's going to get a more healthy product from regenerative agriculture. Also, it's good for the company that's buying it because it's going to be more resilient. The farmer's going to be more resilient and able to offer better prices. Also, it's going to be better for the environment, right? Because you're going to have more biodiversity as a result of this. So, and carbon, you're going to sequester more carbon. So having, I know sustainability managers we talk to are always struggling with, what do we prioritize now? What do we prioritize? Is it carbon, or should we be doing biodiversity, or should we be doing waste? But all of these are on the same, when they get outside of environmental, social issues, all of them, are starting to align more and more, or they've always been aligned maybe, but the vision is starting to be more clear of their alignment. That's one trend I'm really excited about.
So I'd pile on a little bit to what Elijah said. I too am really excited about even the phrase regenerative as opposed to the phrase sustainability. It's sort of a recognition that we're in a deficit on the planet right now, and we need to not just sustain where we are in terms of our level of consumption, but actually regenerate the planet in order to be able to sustain people. Related in the clean energy space, which is where Steve and I work, I think one of the most exciting transitions that we're starting to see is a real focus on material impact of clean energy procurement from the corporate community. So at one time, corporations were focused on achieving 100% renewable energy procurement goal. And as more and more companies are achieving that sort of on paper and procuring enough renewable energy to offset their annual energy consumption, but they're realizing, well, but wait, my data center or my grocery store is still on any given day using carbon intensive power. And so the mindset is shifting to how can I ensure that my facilities and products are being made and delivered 100% zero carbon power all the time, everywhere. And that's a very different mindset where renewable energy becomes a means to an end instead of the end in and of itself. So that focus on material impact is an exciting trend. And then the third one that I would really add, and I hope this becomes a trend, it's certainly a topic of conversation right now, and I hope that it becomes a sustained topic, and that is the question of justice and environmental justice, energy justice, and the role that sustainability across all of our fields can play in increasing equity across our communities and across our economy and across our country and across the world. So that's one that is newer. I think it's not newer for everyone, but I think it's becoming much more mainstream over the course of what's been happening in our country over the summer. And I hope that that's really sustained over time.
Thanks. Also a great point. I just have one more question I want to squeeze in really quickly before we get to Q&A. We thought this was an important question because there are a lot of people, including a lot of students on this call, who are interested in making sustainability a focus in their careers. So do you have any advice for them as they finish up school and enter the workforce as either entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs?
So I'll jump in here. I think, especially as an entrepreneur, I think the biggest lesson I learned was over the past years is that patience is a virtue. You're going to be bringing people up to speed, and maybe you're also more enthusiastic or passionate about things than even people senior to yourself. So it's good to be patient and just to understand that people are coming at things from a different direction or looking to work at a different pace on certain items. The other thing I would just recommend for people entering the workforce is, just remember that your career is a marathon, not a sprint. I think especially now during COVID, I think all of us on this panel probably, it's very stressful with COVID and interacting. Offices are shut. If you're in industries where there's physical movement to people in construction, that's constrained as well. So it's just helpful to be patient and mindful of the fact that hopefully, 1-2 years from now, the world's going to be materially different. The last thing is don't worry about being wrong or having your ideas not implemented. If I'm 3 for 10, that's pretty good. It's like a baseball stat. That's pretty good in baseball, but that's also pretty good when you're looking to push the limits and be an entrepreneur at work. So that's all I had.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
I might also just add to expand your idea of what sustainability tracks look like. My undergrad was in a program called Earth Systems, and I certainly didn't think that I would come out and go into the food industry, although I definitely became interested in it early on. But most people think of the sort of negative externalities of the meat industry as directly impacting animals. Occasionally they'll think about it from an environmental or human rights standpoint. But agriculture is responsible for 15% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. And there are many other sectors and areas that might be contributing to an unsustainable industry that you might not be thinking of yet. Obviously, I on this panel will be pushing the food angle. We would love to see more people moving into the big food space from a sustainability angle. But I think broadening your definition of what it means to work in sustainability will help you find paths that you're much more interested in.
That's a great point too. Thank you, Annie. And I know we're running short on time already, so I want to squeeze in some of these questions that have come from the audience, and then we'll have some just chance for each of the panelists to give a quick closing statement. But we have a question here. What are the challenges of becoming an entrepreneur in a large company where there may be significant red tape? Does anybody want to take that question?
Steve and I may be best, with Steve working for one of the world's largest utilities, and me prior working for two very large institutions, Walmart with 2.2 million people around the world, and the federal government, and the Pentagon, where we had 20,000 people just in one building. And I'll pile on to the last question too. I would say, particularly if you're interested in entrepreneurial roles, but I think this is somewhat true for entrepreneurial roles as well. I love the GW minor in sustainability. So your major is in sort of a normal degree with that sustainability minor laid on. Not many universities are set up that way, and I think it was really brilliant of GW to set up that way. it's very hard to get jobs in big corporations when you have bachelor's or master's that are just sustainability. They want people with finance and marketing and public policy, depending on what the role is. So get those kind of mainstream degrees and then layer that sustainability lens on is always one of my pieces of advice. I see Daniel also asked a question. In full disclosure, Daniel was a summer intern at Reba and was amazing. So thank you, Daniel, for chiming in. I'll kind of answer both of these questions because they're related. Understanding how decisions are made within large organizations can quickly change your mindset from bureaucracy being seen as a red tape to pathways to get to yes. And if you're interested in working with large organizations, whether it's municipalities, governments, corporations, understanding who the key decision makers are, and it's often at what I call the upper middle management level. So often people think, oh, if I just get the CEO to agree. The CEO may agree in principle, but it's ultimately SVPs and VPs who are the ones that can actually apply resources to getting projects kicked off. So understanding those sort of upper middle management layers, who are those decision makers there, and pitching ideas to them and how those ideas ultimately benefit their core goals and objectives. And layering that in together is really the key to turn red tape into green lights. Hey, I like that phrase. I might keep that one, turning red tape into green lights.
Thanks for handling both of those questions. Yeah, and it's nice to see that reunion happening. I know we're quickly running out of time, so I want to offer each of you just 20 or 30 seconds to any last thoughts you might have or anything else you want to say to the audience before we close out. Miranda, I know you have to leave a little early. Yeah,
I'm sorry I have to leave a little early. I have a media call in just about 5 minutes. I guess my last piece of advice to all of you as you're thinking about your next steps in your career is the importance of learning how to raise money. So whether you are kicking off a new venture as an entrepreneur, you're going to have to go pitch investors. At a minimum, you're going to have to pitch friends and family to invest in your idea. If you're working inside of a big company, you're going to have to know how to pitch the CFO and the COO on how to apply resources to your project. If you're working for a nonprofit, you're going to have to learn how to fundraise. So it's a skill set that's extraordinarily valuable across anything you want to go do next. So that is something that I would recommend everybody take some time in your internships or your summer jobs or whatever you're doing and really get that raising capital experience.
Thanks, Miranda. I guess, well, we're already over time. Does anybody else want to add any final closing thoughts?
All I was going to say is it's awesome. I love to see all the passion around sustainability. And this week, because of the election, we all have a chance to make a little bit of more of an impact than you usually would. So just vote. It's important.
Thanks, Elijah. And I'm sorry we ran out of time. I know we do need to close out. So thanks again to all of our panelists and for all the audience that submitted questions and everyone that attended. I hope.
Hannah, just an amazing job you have done moderating this session. You just did an incredible job. I really, a big round of applause for Hannah, everybody. This is just amazing. This is part of it. This is really great job here. So thank you very much. Thank you all speakers for coming in. This is just incredible here. We have happy hour, I think after a full day here. So please join us for happy hour and we can enjoy. Hannah, I'll give it back to you to end it, but thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I mean, I have nothing else to add. I know we need to close out. So thanks again and enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.